Your father emerges from the only shelter you have ever inhabited, takes one final look backward, and closes that door for the last time. There is no bolt to secure it. There is no reason to secure it. You will not return. Beyond that threshold lies the compacted earth floor where your grandmother's body now rests. The fire hearth your mother has tended faithfully through every single day of your existence. The sleeping corner where your youngest siblings rest. Before you stretches an unfamiliar path leading to a settlement you have never seen. In a season already brutal enough to have claimed people within your own circle. Your household moves down that road at this very moment, everyone traveling together. The elderly walking alongside children, the single ox straining under the load. Your entire remaining possessions loaded on a two-wheeled cart. And here is the reality nobody speaks aloud as you begin into the colourless winter of 1315. Most of those walking these paths this season will not arrive as complete families. People you can hear breathing next to you right now, your own blood, may not witness spring again. This describes the true character of a winter migration through the medieval age. And regarding the cold, as you are about to understand, it was merely the smallest danger. Before we advance any distance on this journey, let us abandon the picture you have constructed in your mind, because that false understanding will prove fatal out here. Picture medieval travel as popular imagination presents it, a small, uncomplicated affair. A figure in dark clothing on horseback, a merchant with a pack animal. A brief journey between neighboring settlements beneath generous skies. We envision people as largely sedentary, with movement being an infrequent, unremarkable occurrence. This situation bears no resemblance to that image. This winter you are attempting one of the most perilous undertakings any medieval household could pursue. You are pulling an entire household away from its foundation, both those young and vigorous and those weak and vulnerable, and relocating it across terrain without dependable maps, without authorities for safety, without reliable shelter, and without any mechanism to summon assistance should circumstances turn disastrous. People performed this action. They performed it more regularly than historical accounts acknowledge. Numerous individuals perished in the attempt, not through singular catastrophic moments, but gradually and silently, through miscalculations and frozen nightfall after frozen nightfall. So we will trace a single household, your household, and understand what such winter migration genuinely demanded. First, you must recognize the motivation compelling anyone to do this. Why you endure this suffering rather than remaining secure by your hearth. Because nobody abandons hearth in winter for trivial reasons, and your reason stands as the direst possible: starvation. Throughout the previous pair of years, the weather itself has become an adversary to all of Europe. Torrential precipitation initiated it, unrelenting, unprecedented rainfall arriving in spring and persisting without ceasing. Week upon week, water saturated the planted fields, destroyed emerging grain, flattened whatever sparse harvests managed germination. Crops failed that year, then failed again the following year. Bread values reached levels no living individual recalls ever witnessing. Beyond what ordinary families possessed resources to acquire, then exceeding even what wealthier households could afford. This represents the great hunger spreading across the continent as people progressively expire together. Your community has experienced its portion of burials. The castle's grain reserves sit vacant or remain sealed away. Thus your father completed the grim calculation, one that thousands executed simultaneously this winter. To remain equals certain death through hunger. To journey onward, chasing rumored locations offering sustenance or labor or family members who could provide shelter, presents at minimum a possibility. This represents no optimistic expedition. This is desperation wagered by those with absolutely nothing remaining to forfeit. Examine those actually traveling this path, because this fact alone makes it catastrophically dangerous. Within your mental image, A wanderer appears as a robust young male, muscular, bearing weapons, marching without fatigue for extended stretches. Instead, observe those around you. Your aged grandfather has never previously walked beyond the marketplace, and his lungs already produce troubling sounds in the frigid air. Your mother carries your baby secured firmly to her torso, while your younger daughter, not quite 6, will manage perhaps a half-morning's walk independently before requiring placement upon the cart. The ox pulling your possessions is already undernourished. This expedition contains no soldiers. This constitutes a household. A household progresses at its slowest component's rhythm. It pauses when offspring weep. It stops when an elder cannot proceed further. Every advantage a solitary traveler possesses, you do not possess. You cannot move swiftly. You cannot go without. You cannot abandon any member. And winter remains indifferent to your situation. Your survival now depends entirely upon what rests in that cart. And substantially less rests there than you actually require. Grain occupies space, if fortune permitted you to retain any, guarded with extreme care, because it represents the literal difference between existence and expiration. Your father's instruments rest there, equipment he refuses to sell because they constitute his sole means of earning bread. Toward the journey's end sits all remaining provisions: blankets, cooking implements, modest salt stores, currency the household managed to conceal within garments where robbers might not search, and the ox. And you will contemplate persistently the grim mathematics of this situation. The ox transports everything you possess, yet the ox requires nourishment, and within a hungry winter, no vegetation or fodder develops anywhere. Daily you confront an agonizing selection: provide the creature with adequate food so it continues pulling, or consume that food yourself. Every single rotation of the earth you silently wrestle this unbearable calculation. Supply too much burden, and the animal collapses. Supply too little, and everyone goes famished. No satisfactory solution exists. The path simply grows longer with each step. And you must fully comprehend exactly how immense this distance truly is, because this differs completely from journeying in our contemporary existence. Distances we regard as substantial occur within an afternoon. But a household proceeding by foot, accompanied by an animal and cart and small children, through winter across broken pathways, accomplishes perhaps what an individual in our time strolls through in one morning's outing, then invests the remainder of daylight on that same ground. On successful days, you progress perhaps 10 or 12 miles. On unsuccessful days, when ground becomes muddy or the little ones weaken or something breaks, you advance 3 miles or 4, or perhaps not at all. Thus, a destination reachable by a rider in a pair of days transforms into an expedition consuming weeks for your family. Weeks of bitter temperatures, weeks of dwindling provisions, weeks of exposure during nights. When your father resolved to depart, he was not committing the family to a grueling day-long trek. He was condemning you to a protracted, exhausting trial, lasting as long as what people currently spend on leisurely vacation. Yet simultaneously, each single rotation produces new dangers attempting to terminate your life. Measurements in this world count not by distance markers. They measure in how many nights you must endure to traverse them. Then the temperatures descend. And at last you comprehend why we call it the minimal threat. Not because it was benevolent, but because it represented only the commencement. Medieval cold differs from contemporary cold. You cannot step indoors and regain warmth. You cannot become dry. That constitutes the actual terror. When moisture-laden precipitation falls, which transpires repeatedly, it penetrates woolen garments completely and never dries. You progress drenched, and you sleep drenched, and that moisture destroys you long preceding actual frost. What we currently term hypothermia has no designation here. It approaches gradually. Initially, the body shudders, followed by peculiar clumsiness, fumbling extremities, then a deceptively comfortable sensation, and an urge to simply rest briefly against something. and among the elderly and very small, whose physiology cannot sustain internal temperature, that impulse toward resting marks the conclusion. A grandmother who settles against a tree trunk to catch breath, an infant who grows too peaceful against its mother's chest. Cold does not shriek, it whispers. It claims the most vulnerable first, collecting them during darkness. Your feet sustain the opening and most severe damage, though nobly composes songs celebrating them. Examine what you actually wear underfoot on this passage. Not protective footwear as understood, waterproof and insulating, but thin leather coverings, fragile, assembled by hand, disintegrating at the undersole, or, for the most impoverished, cloth scraps secured with twine. You traverse perpetually, all daylight hours, across freezing muck and submerged ground and crystallized precipitation. Your feet become soaked within the initial 60 minutes each morning, and they never experience dryness. Dermis deteriorates and tears. Freezing penetrates inward until sensation departs from your toes completely. That absence of feeling offers no relief. It signals danger because that represents frostbite initiating its destructive process, murdering cells progressively from extremity inward. Someone experiences loss of digits this way, then perhaps the foot itself. And in a realm without medical treatment, a foot that becomes necrotic constitutes a predetermined fatality requiring weeks to accomplish. And even stopping short of that, a household whose feet have deteriorated simply cannot continue. A household incapable of continuing this season does not endure, so you press onward on destroyed feet because you must, concealing suffering from offspring because halting means expiration. Every measure traveled extracts payment your form cannot sustain, because night times constitute the genuine adversary, and they stretch impossibly extended. This represents winter in northern territories when shadow consumes the majority of the day, when celestial light barely surmounts tree height before descending once more. You possess approximately 8 hours of usable grey illumination, and every single rotation matters because becoming stranded by sunset in exposed areas means catastrophe. Therefore, daylight regulates your entire existence. You rise in shadow, aching, rigid, hungry. You move deliberately to cover distance while visibility permits. And well before illumination vanishes, you must urgently identify somewhere, any location, to survive the 18 hours of blackness and freezing conditions approaching. Where will you rest? This question determines absolutely everything, and the possibilities are uniformly dreadful. If Providence favors you, you discover a settlement and request or exchange payment for a barn corner warmed by animal heat. That constitutes decadence. That represents an excellent evening. If circumstances prove less favorable, perhaps a monastery appears, and here resides an overlooked reality of the medieval age. Religious institutions operated the nearest equivalent to a shelter infrastructure that existed. Monastic communities and healing houses accommodated wanderers, dispensed meager provisions, offered security from weather out of spiritual obligation. However, these establishments remain scarce, separated by considerable distances, and during famine conditions, they overflow. Their own stores deplete, rejecting multitudes of desperate arrivals they cannot preserve. And should neither settlement nor monastery materialize before darkness arrives, you pursue the action every instinct protests against. You stop outside. You construct whatever protection you can manage beside a stone wall, a hillside, the cart itself. You ignite a flame if combustible material exists, and you gather your entire household into a single shivering cluster, sharing body warmth. You remain conscious in shifts, because losing consciousness into such extreme cold might prevent awakening. And because creatures inhabit shadow and seek out vulnerable prey. And now discuss hunger itself, because this represents the true assassin. The one paintings never display, the one evacuating roads of households resembling yours. You began transporting insufficient provisions. Everyone does, because provisions are universally limited. Yet a form traversing all daylight in extreme conditions expends energy at terrifying velocity, requiring substantially more than a stationary body indoors at this identical period when you possess substantially less to provide. So you apportion carefully. You observe your offspring consuming while you do not. You declare yourself satisfied, a fabrication. Grain stores diminish. You purchase what commerce offers in settlements you traverse, but tariffs prove extortionate, and your modest currency evaporates more rapidly than imagined. When supplies terminate, you execute what starving populations invariably do. You consume non-food substances, tree bark, underground roots excavated from frozen soil. The recorders of this catastrophe, individuals enduring 1315, transcribed accounts of individuals eating materials too abhorrent to describe, of familial bonds and decorum deteriorating under famishment without limits. This realm you traverse contains not merely hunger, but starvation. Starvation transforms civilizations because desperate circumstances inspire desperate reactions, and not exclusively self-directed ones. Which brings consideration to fellow travelers populating these paths, because isolation does not characterize your circumstances, and that does not provide reassurance you might envision. These roads overflow this winter with households identical to yours, all retreating from comparable hunger, all directing themselves toward matching supposed sanctuaries, all competing for equivalent scanty provisions and similar warmed structures and matching monastic rations. In prosperous seasons, travelers bring welcome novelty. During famine years, an unfamiliar arrival presents danger, simply another consuming mouth, a probable illness carrier, one extra person claiming resources. Therefore, settlements bolt entrances against you. Communities position themselves with suspicious demeanor and implements, not from cruelty, but from their own depletion and protective instinct toward offspring. Doors that would open in better circumstances remain sealed. You witness a fortified settlement coldly determine your household represents no concern and thrust you backward into freezing conditions. Starvation does not only consume stomachs, it freezes compassion universally and instantly. And among these desperate multitudes exist those who ceased expecting assistance and commenced taking. This becomes the peril popular narratives transform into heroic tales. Nothing resembles heroism in this reality. Beyond the Lord's domain boundaries, where their authority concludes, you encounter absolute lawlessness. Open roads between separate territories provide only your numerical strength and personal cunning as defense. These passages harbor criminals. Certain are hardened brigands, yet many within famine conditions are simply agricultural laborers transformed within a seasonal cycle to starving individuals possessing weapons and exhausted patience. Your isolated household with an ox and cart laden with possessions constitutes precisely what they hunt. They do not seek confrontation. Generally, they desire your provisions, your livestock, your implements, the exact items preserving your existence. They will seize them. This explains why families attempt congregating with other travelers, accumulating because isolation equates with vulnerability, while larger groups present tougher targets. This explains why every approaching stranger causes your father's grip to tighten. Out here you cannot distinguish, prior to revelation, whether the figure emerging is a fellow survivor or your journey's termination. Then the landscape transforms into adversary as well, because pathways are not passages as you conceive them. Disregard motion picture depictions of smooth routes. What you pursue is a trail worn by previous foot traffic and hooves and wheeled conveyances. During winter, that trail becomes a torrent of crystallizing mud sufficiently profound to engulf a wheel to its rim and confine it. Your ox strains. Your cart becomes adhered. Your entire household applies its collective strength and shoves within the icy particles and surrenders an hour. Irreplaceable daylight drains away just transporting cart-length distances. Signage does not exist. You possess no dependable cartography, not for individuals resembling you. Navigation occurs through collective inquiry. You petition at every settlement for directions toward the next location, whether crossing points remain navigable, whether roads ahead are dangerous. Frequently, the replies contain inaccuracies or information outdated or come from someone never traveling beyond a handful of miles from birthplace. Mistakes occur. You pursue a pathway leading nowhere. You consume a rotation accomplishing no distance. And rotation consumption here carries no trivial consequences. Squandering daylight equals provisions exhausted for nothing accomplished. A cycle nearer to grain depletion with nothing beneficial to exhibit. Becoming disoriented this season potentially represents fatal miscalculation. And the creature pressing forward at your side, struggling through every depression and incline, remains your survival's foundation. Winter depletes it identically to everyone. The animal lacks mechanical properties. It lives, it freezes, it starves like everyone. And within famine conditions, no feeding resources materialize, no frozen grasslands, no hay you can procure at an affordable rate. Daily it weakens, skeletal features becoming increasingly visible each morning, motion growing sluggish, until one terrible rotation, it simply stops entirely. No pulling, no coercion produces additional movement. When the animal collapses, your circumstances shift completely. Every item atop that cart, every possession remaining, everything anticipated for constructing new existence becomes suddenly transportable exclusively through bodily carrying capacity. You stand above the collapsed form and formulate calculations only desperation permits. What remains behind in snow, surrendered forever, so remaining items fit. The implements, or the grain, or the protective garments, and one darker consideration a famished household cannot suppress, examining the dying animal. Because flesh constitutes flesh, and starvation demolishes restraint, the creature's demise extends beyond mere obstacle. For countless households, this moment transformed journeys from manageable to hopeless. The final and most catastrophic impediment, the one eliminating households seasonally, manifests as obstacles formed by water, flowing rivers. In contemporary experience, a river appears as a line on geographic representation, with spanning construction crossing it. In your reality, a river materializes as an impassable barrier and executioner. Bridge installations are uncommon and valuable possessions, typically controlled by nobility or settlements demanding compensation you may lack. Consequently, you usually must cross at shallower sections, and winter transforms that water into snow-fed currents and rainwater, brown, rapid, chilling enough to terminate cardiac function instantly. You urge the animal forward, and current pulls its limbs. You transport offspring one at a time across compressed shoulders, feeling riverbeds shifting underneath. Comprehending a single misstep means submersion in water so frigid you could not remain afloat regardless of capability, which you probably lack anyway. Households perished at such passages. A conveyance overturned, footing disappeared, and suddenly the river absorbs a child or grandfather or remaining possessions, and nobody possesses any capability whatsoever to intervene. Where currents do not flow rapidly, surface freezes. Then it provides alternate fatality. Ice appearing dependable, yet concealing nothing, tempting crossing, remaining until your weight penetrates and submerges you into darkness. Darkness harbors something additional. An alarm so primitive it inhabits every one of these travelers' deepest consciousness. Predatory animals. This particular terror has been so thoroughly suppressed in our consciousness that we disregard its authentic danger. But throughout medieval winters, within territories of extensive forests and harsh climate, predatory animals constituted legitimate fear. Famine conditions represented the apex of danger. When wilderness herbivores perish from scarcity and predators experience comparable desperation, they overcome their avoidance of human populations. They pursue pathways. They shadow the vulnerable. Positioned around your minimal fire through extended darkness, you perceive them, that extended vocalization reverberating across shadowed slopes, nearer certain evenings than others. You intensify the flames. You maintain children centrally positioned. You sustain consciousness because an isolated animal straying from its gathering, a member falling behind at dusk, represents the gathering's perfect target. The woodland providing summer fuel and sanctuary becomes now a hostile, famished expanse. Every nocturnal hour outdoors means prolonged listening. Then weather itself shifts dramatically within minimal elapsed time, from grey irritation into phenomenon erasing surroundings. Precipitation arrives, and initially appears almost lovely, then persists indefinitely, and wind intensifies alongside it, and abruptly you cannot perceive the passage, cannot distinguish timber, cannot observe your own arm extended outward. This phenomenon constitutes one of winter travel's significant wordless executioners, because perception of navigation orientation disappears. Individuals wander in repeating patterns, paces distant from security, freezing to death, oblivious to sanctuary's position. During intense snowfall, only one option exists: remain stationary, huddle collectively, position backs toward wind direction, anticipate clearing, and petition it happens before temperatures complete their work. Continuing movement without sight means potentially departing from the passage into steep banks or into open countryside where no rescuer will ever locate you, and accumulation accomplishes additional damage extending beyond immediate blindness. It covers the pathway behind you and before you, so that when conditions finally clear, the passage you followed has vanished entirely, smoothed beneath white covering, requiring navigation discovery repeatedly across landscape now unfamiliar and wholly uncaring regarding your survival status. Discuss forthrightly the phenomenon eliminating more travelers than predators and brigands and water passages combined. The unobserved, imperceptible assassin stalking every medieval expedition. Physical ailment. Your body, chilled, saturated, depleted, and inadequately nourished, represents a form defenseless against illness. The traveling action itself exposes you to sickness perpetually. You consume from streams and sources polluted by animal waste and preceding travelers' refuse. The result manifests as intestinal distress and bloody dysentery, evacuating your form of vigor and hydration and terminating weakened individuals within rotations. You huddle for warmth inside shelters with unfamiliar individuals, sharing respiration, their coughing, their elevated temperatures, and ailment transmits among bodies in enclosed darkness. Usually your form might overcome these threats, but circumstances prove abnormal. Hunger destroys defensive capacity, rendering previously surmountable illnesses now fatal to famished multitudes. This represents the dreadful collaboration hollowing medieval civilization across these periods. Starvation and illness, partnering, each amplifying the other's lethality. Individuals expiring throughout this catastrophe did not strictly succumb to skeletal starvation. They deteriorated through malnutrition, then finished through fevers, dysentery, respiratory illness that a nourished form would dismiss casually. And roadside, exhausted and exposed, vulnerability reaches maximum extremity. The moment arrives that every traveling household dreads, when sickness breaches your interior circle. Perhaps your grandfather's problematic respiration converts to unrelenting coughing. Perhaps your youngest suddenly burns with fever, too feeble lifting her skull. Now you encounter selection so agonizing that our privileged existence cannot adequately grasp it. Do you halt? Halting signifies consuming remaining provisions without advancing, endangering the collective for a single person. Pressing forward means positioning your unwell child onto a jolting conveyance through penetrating conditions, understanding that the passage itself probably produces what kills her. No specialist exists for summoning. No remedy provides effectiveness. Only prayer and grandmother's recollection of ancient treatments, plant derivatives and heat and whispered invocations. and persistent observation hour after hour, determining which direction development will proceed. Certain families confronting this situation faced selection too unbearable for humans to contemplate, and historical recorders obliquely reference guardians no longer maintaining sufficient resources for all dependents and nightmares following. This expresses what starvation accomplished, not merely extracting existence, compelling the surviving to select in manners demolishing them irreparably. And navigating everything, what compels continuing forward? What drives a household positioning each limb alternately through dampness and temperatures and anguish? Two factors, and you should recognize each. Initially, genuine absence of alternatives. Backward points to definite termination. Progression alone provides any possibility of continuation. But secondly, exists faith. And grasping these communities requires recognizing this. You inhabit a civilization immersed in devotion. And your perception of this catastrophe differs from meteorological failure and failed cultivation. You perceive it as divine retribution. It represents penance for transgression, a test from the celestial realm. That comprehension operates dually. It generates anxiety, dread that divinity has withdrawn blessing. Yet simultaneously it bestows what preserves you from despair's complete domination: significance. You petition at every roadside shrine. You implore saints defending your route. You maintain conviction. You must maintain conviction that suffering participates in superior purpose, that if you persevere, if commitment remains steadfast, mercy potentially waits at conclusion. Inside a realm providing no alternative solace, that conviction carries weight. For numerous households, it represented everything, carrying them further than provisions ever might have. Then subsequent to rotations resembling lifetimes, subsequent to interring sorrow beside pathways and surrendering fragments of your being at every crossing, you discern it extending on the horizon, the settlement, the fortifications, the location every hardship targeted. Your spirits elevate. And this marks the ultimate brutality of medieval journeys, because arrival does not equate to deliverance. That settlement carries fortifications for purpose, and during famine, those walls function not as welcoming structures. They exist to exclude people resembling you. You approach the entry and sentries examine your diminished, filthy, destroyed household, and they perceive precisely what previous settlements observed: supplementary famished persons, probable disease carrier, inhabitant the community cannot sustain. Entrance comes neither assured nor effortless. You perhaps must demonstrate interior kinship or resources to expend, or expertise the settlement requires. Or perhaps they refuse outright, rejecting your family from the destination where you sacrificed everything to arrive. And even should gates open, you enter as outsider, unknown entity without protections, without professional associations guarding your father's abilities, lacking property, without community position, at the lowest tier of distrustful settlement midst catastrophe. Journey completion does not deliver warmth and relief. It constitutes additional survival contest, merely surrounded by perimeters. So we retreat from the killing temperatures and calculate genuine expense of your passage, because this part holds greatest significance. When we envision medieval death, we gravitate towards spectacular conclusions: military engagements, plague outbreaks, judicial punishments. Yet the factual, astonishing reality remains that for the majority during most periods, death originated from ordinary circumstances transformed deadly. And winter passage concentrated each ordinary danger into single, terrible portion of pathway. Ask what truly eliminated households commencing this season, yet never completely arriving. Temperatures constitute merely commencement. Individuals died of deprivation, so weakened that anything could terminate them. They died of dysentery and fevers from contaminated moisture and crowded arrangements. They died at water crossings and throughout frozen darkness. They died because they were elderly or extremely young or currently ailing. And the passage demanded capabilities their forms could not provide. They died particularly because they possessed no buffer, no additional sustenance or bodily reserves or defensive protection compensating when circumstances deteriorated. And circumstances consistently deteriorated. That explains the staggering mortality, not from singular, overwhelming calamity, but from persistent, methodical gathering of modest perils against individuals carrying no surplus. And this reality you should transport backward into warmth, away from 1315's winter. We progress through contemporary existence so unencumbered that we have disremembered what passage previously demanded. We disremember that journeying once represented something you might not endure, that families loaded existences onto conveyances and advanced into temperature with comprehension that certain members might not exit the opposite terminus. Those executing this lacked incompetence and lacked helplessness. They exhibited bravery impossible for us to envision adequately, selecting terrifying danger over certain demise remaining behind, gambling everything possessed and each beloved person on possibility of improvement beyond the landscape's curve. Numerous lost that calculation. Numerous prevailed. And the settlements and municipalities they finally achieved through determined effort incorporated inhabitants from precisely such survivors, such households retreating from depleting lands through deadly winter and recommencing possessing nothing. Every crowded medieval settlement contained inhabitants who undertook equivalent journeys and retained recollection and never verbalized those who did not succeed. Therefore, next iteration, you experience tedium concerning extended transportation, or uncomfortable temperature, or passage requiring additional duration. Visualize that household on the crystalline passage in 1315. Visualize the ox laboring through dampness, the child excessively motionless atop the conveyance, the father gazing backward for final occasion at dwelling he will never re-inhabit. The household traversing into shadow, possessing exclusively one another and delicate, persistent determination. That epitomized passage for nearly all human history. Neither excitement nor pleasurable excursion, wager with expiration, executed by ordinary people desiring exclusively preservation of their beloved. And comprehending them, you grasp something fundamental. Accounts neglect conveying that temperatures bore authenticity and cruelty, yet constituted the least threatening element they experienced, and that they advanced regardless, for those they cherished, represents among history's least acknowledged yet magnificent demonstrations of valor.